she is not writing, she enjoys exploring flea markets in search of vintage microscopes and getting intentionally lost in the woods. You can find her on Instagram at KADrew. Kayla Cottingham is a New York Times and Publishers Weekly best-selling author and librarian. Originally from Salt Lake City, Utah, Kayla lives in Boston, where she loves to go hiking in the woods, play RPGs, and snuggle on the couch with her ridiculously large black cat squid. Find her on Instagram at KCotCamp. Diana Urban is an author of dark, twisty thrillers, including All Your Twisted Secrets from Harper Teen and These Deadly Games from Wednesday Books. Her novels have been published internationally, and she'll be featured in the first and last anthology from Penguin Workshop. When she's not torturing fictional characters, she freelances in content writing and digital marketing. She lives with her husband and cat in Boston and enjoys reading, playing video games, fawning over cute animals, and looking at the beach from a safe distance. Find her on Instagram at Diana Urban. And finally, our moderator, Nicole Lesperance, is the author of The Depths and The Wide Starling, as well as The Nightmare Thief duology for middle grade readers. She grew up on Cape Cod, spent a few years in London, and now lives near Boston with her husband, 2 kids, and 2 rambunctious black cats. Her books have received strong reviews from Kirkus, Booklist, and ACCB, and The Wide Starlight was longlisted for the Massachusetts Book Award. In her spare time, Nicole likes to practice yoga, knit, and read tarot cards, perfect for sailing. Find her on Instagram at Nicole Lesperance.
Can everybody hear me okay? Is this better? Okay. So thank you so much to Lauren and to everyone at the Salem Literary Festival for having us.
Oh, it's green.
Oh, there we go. Is that better? Okay.
Now we're cooking with gas.
Thank you so much for having us. This has been really lovely, and it's great to be in Salem today on a pretty surprisingly nice day. When I was first approached to moderate this panel, I looked at the lineup of books that we have, and I saw how wildly different they all are. And I kind of thought to myself, what are we going to talk about that all of these books have in common? Because we've got sapphic horror, we've got a mystery thriller set on a cruise ship, and we have deeply atmospheric dark academia. So I really wasn't sure where to go with this. I read each of the books, and I realized that kind of the key similarity with all of them is a very propulsive sense of suspense. So, and Lauren was very helpful at coming up with some ideas for the conversation as well. So I would love to talk about suspense as it relates to each of your books. And if we could start just with everyone giving a brief description of your latest book so that everyone has an idea of what we're talking about.
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Kayla Cottingham, and I am the author of My Dearest Darkest and This Delicious Death, which is the book I'll be talking about mostly today. This Delicious Death was released back in April, and it's about a group of girls who have recently gone through a pandemic. Not that one, don't worry about it. This one, instead of making it hard to breathe, instead makes you crave human flesh. And so they can only survive by subsisting on cannibalism, basically. But the government was able to create a synthetic version of human flesh, creatively called Sin Flesh, that are basically allow them to reintegrate into society and not be quite as menacing as they were at the beginning of this story. But because they've all just graduated from high school, they decide to go on a road trip together to my fictionalized version of Coachella. However, things go bad when one of them accidentally goes feral and eats a member of a boy band. And they have to figure out why she went feral and also hide the body, because that's what friends do.
Hi everyone, I'm Diana Urban. I've written All Your Twisted Secrets, These Deadly Games, and most recently Lying in the Deep. which I'll be talking about most, Lying in the Deep, is about a girl named Jade who her boyfriend has just dumped her for her best friend. And to escape her heartbreak, she wants to go on a fictionalized semester at sea program where she'll be cruising the world for a semester, seeing all these great places. She's so excited for an escape, but lo and behold, when she's on the pier about to board the ship, her ex and her ex-best friend are also about to board. So as this cruise gets underway, she's making new friends, she's getting a new crush, but she's also growing an obsession with this ex and ex-best friend who betrayed her. And then, of course, in all of my books, as they happen, a murder happens. And because Jade has been so obsessed with this couple, and the murder victim, as you find out on page 1, so it's not really a spoiler, is the ex-best friend, she is suspect number 1. So before the ship makes port in Gibraltar, she needs to figure out who the real murderer is before they make port, before local authorities come on board, before she is arrested, or before the killer strikes again.
So, hi everybody, I am Kelly Andrew, and I am the author of The Whispering Dark and Your Blood, My Bones, but today I'll be talking about The Whispering Dark. It is a college-based dark academia, which takes place at a fictionalized college just outside of Boston, and the protagonist is a scholarship recipient who is attending this new age school that teaches its students how to walk between worlds, and her first day, where she's trying to fly under the radar and just sort of make a good impression, it goes horribly. She makes an awful impression, and it turns out that the upperclassman she makes an awful impression upon is the one she gets stuck solving a murder with later on in the book when several students start turning up dead. And the two of them are forced to spend a lot of time together, working together to figure out, one, what's behind the death of the students, and two, what's lurking in the space between worlds. And before the semester is out, and either of them are consumed by what is living in between the worlds. So it is a little bit of a dark academia, a little bit of a portal fantasy.
My most recent book, The Depths, is what I have jokingly called a Trothic book, which is a mashup of tropical and gothic. So my family's been calling it the Trothic book. It basically, what I did was I took a traditional gothic story, and instead of setting it in a haunted house, I set it on a haunted island. And it's the story of this girl named Addie who goes on a vacation with her mother and her new stepfather to what seems like a perfect tropical paradise, a private island. But pretty immediately when she arrives, she realizes that things are a little bit strange and eerie. The flowers are changing colors, the birds seem to be calling her name, and there's this little girl in the woods who no one else can see who keeps asking her to play hide and seek. And then one night she meets a boy on the beach, and the two of them start exploring the caves that run underneath the island. And she starts learning all these kind of twisted secrets in the history of the island. And she realizes that when the island wants somebody, it doesn't let them go. So she kind of gets caught up in this mystery, figuring out what happened on the island and also how to escape from the island which wants to keep her. So just moving on to suspense in general, I would love to know what do you enjoy most about writing suspense and kind of very plot-driven, propulsive stories?
So I can start with this one. So I grew up reading a lot of mysteries, a lot of R.L. Stein, Stephen King. I loved books that would give you a good puzzle to solve, and I loved that feeling of getting to the end of the book and there's a shock. Like I thought I knew who done it or who's terrorizing this street or whatever it was, and then it's someone who I didn't suspect the whole time. But then looking back, I can see all the clues, and I would reread those books and spot all the things I should have caught the first time. And when I'm writing a story, I love doing that same thing. I want to create that feeling for readers where I'm surprising them and I'm giving them a fun puzzle to solve, and whether or not they solve the puzzle early for themselves, if they see the clues or not, I'm still giving them a really good time and creating this like really fast-paced story that is just really exciting, and they don't know exactly how it's going to end, and there's multiple twists, and I love to really keep readers guessing until the end.
Kind of going off of you said you grew up reading all these stories. I'm the same, but with movies. I watched every horror movie, every scary movie with my brother and I would watch movies we probably shouldn't have that were on TV when we were flicking through. And one of my favorite things about horror movies that we would come across is I love that feeling when you're watching a classic slasher flick and you can see the bad guy, but the character can't see it, and you're shouting, "He's behind you! He's got a knife!" Or "Watch out!" But obviously, you're on the other side of the screen, and the character can't see you or hear you. And I love trying to chase that feeling in writing, where you set up a story where you give the reader just enough information to guess at the danger or sense the danger, but obviously the main character who you're going on this journey with does not see the danger, and you can't alert them to it. So that feeling of you're flipping through the page, like when are they going to figure out what's going on? I know what's going on, and I usually do that by writing a 2 point of view story, so you kind of go back and forth, so you learn something in one point of view and go back to the other, and you know it, but the secondary character doesn't, and So I love kind of taking that horror movie aspect and trying to find ways to put it into my writing.
Yeah, I have a very similar backstory where I was one of those kids who was always watching horror movies I shouldn't, and I was a big fan of reading creepypastas and like those Reddit horror stories and things like that, because for whatever reason my parents thought unfettered internet access was like a great idea, and this is the consequence. But I always just really appreciate the being able to build fear and create that sort of tenseness in a scene where, like, even if it's done through things like sentence lengths, right? Yeah. Where it's like, you can really stretch out the way that a reader perceives a certain scene based on, like, where paragraph breaks are, stuff like that. So it does really feel like being an architect, and you're building it piece by piece and getting to draw it out more and more so that the reader is like just engrossed more and more in whatever scene that you're writing, and being able to be the person creating that is very empowering for me as a person with anxiety, because it puts me in control of the thing that is scary to me. And it's one of the main reasons I find myself drawn to writing horror, is because it's a very good way to sort of almost like dissect fear in a way that makes it make sense to me and makes me feel empowered at the same time. Also, I hope readers are. I don't know, there's that too.
I think that's like a really great, I love writing thrillers for teens, because I feel like approaching these things teens are afraid of or struggling with in their day-to-day lives, whether it's bullying or whether it's abandonment issues, and incorporating those things into a thriller, like, it's a safe space for them to examine that kind of fear in a book rather than in their day-to-day lives, and then they can take what they've learned and hopefully it helps them. And I just think that's one reason I love writing for teens.
I think it's fascinating that two of you have mentioned loving horror movies, because I also have anxiety and I am a giant horror movie wimp. Like, I absolutely can't handle them, but I love scary books. Like, that was always my thing. My mom who's here, she did not love us watching, like, bad movies and things like that, but she would let us read anything we wanted. So I remember being like 12 and getting like The Exorcist out of the library, and she was like, "That's fine." And I think the good thing about a scary book is that you can put it down if it becomes too much, and there's never like a jump scare that kind of triggers a panic attack kind of thing. So for me, like, scary suspense books were a good way to get that content without stressing myself out too much. So I'm always fascinated by people who can watch those movies. It's really cool.
I'm a big fan of closing my eyes. That helps a lot.
Peeking through your fingers. Do you think there are, you kind of touched on this, Diana, just now, the differences between a YA suspense and an adult suspense? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on that.
I actually think that I have a very weird perspective on it, because The Whispering Dark sold as adult in the UK, but YA in the United States, because it falls into an upper YA crossover category due to the fact that the character is leaving home for the first time and going to college. And so I do think that it was an interesting, I worked with 2 editors, one for each, while I was doing the revisions, and it was an interesting line to sort of straddle between, you know, making something that was following sort of YA sort of has this, I think very recognizable, familiar, and sometimes comforting formula that, you know, especially in a westernized YA has this sort of 3-act structure, or the formula that we're used to seeing, and I think, like Diana said, you know, horror is always a metaphor used, and even when you watch movies, it's often a metaphor for something else, and it's such a safe space to sort of explore, you know, feelings and change, and the coming of age narrative fits so nicely into, you know, a horror setting. And I think that writing a sort of suspense thriller in a upper YA space allowed for me to deal with some of the typical YA coming of age themes and explore them, but also sort of change the pacing a little bit, and, you know, linger longer in moments that normally, you know, I might have had to speed through or you know, just touch on. So at least that was my experience. It was kind of a back and forth to try to find a nice middle ground.
I think that there are definitely differences in terms of what teens are afraid of versus what adults are afraid of.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, I'm afraid of the IRS, and my characters are more like, uh-oh, what if I kiss? So it's a little different. But I think a lot of it too is just, it's a little bit like what Kendall was talking about in the last panel, where being a teenager is so much about firsts. It's first loves, it's first experiences with death. It's all of those things that as an adult you maybe don't react to exactly the same way because you've been through it before. Whereas writing about a teen experiencing those things, it's much more raw and emotional in a way that is super rewarding for me as an author to be able to dig into. Because I remember what it was like to have those huge firsts that were so emotionally fraught in a way that now I'm like, I mean, it's not great, but so it goes. And I don't see myself writing adult because of that, actually. I would so much rather be able to dig into those very emotional perspectives that you get with teenagers. That is really rewarding to do.
Yeah, I was going to talk a lot about the firsts as well, and also that I feel like writing for YA, I get to examine more what happens when, like, teenagers make mistakes. Like, if they're experiencing things, they're facing challenges that they've never faced before, and they're not going to always approach every scenario with a perfect judgment. And I like to have my protagonists make big mistakes and then learn from those mistakes and grow from them. And I think that YA gives me an opportunity to kind of explore those themes. And of course, adult novels can do that as well, but I really love having flawed, nerdy girls making big mistakes both before the story starts and during the story while they're trying to solve the mystery or whatever it is, and really learn from those and grow as characters and grow the relationships that they have with their friends and maybe their romantic interests as well.
Yeah, I fully agree with that about letting your characters make mistakes. When I think back to my own teenage years, like, I feel like my friends and I were just like one giant messy decision at all times, and like I think there's something really nice about watching a character make a terrible decision and then seeing them like work it out and like get through it, and like maybe you kissed the wrong guy, and like here's how you're gonna like deal with it, or like maybe you did something terrible to your best friend. That like that's okay, like but what are you gonna do next? Right. And how are you gonna come through that? And that's really satisfying to write.
Right, yeah, and everyone makes mistakes. Like, it's a very human thing to not be perfect. But it's really how you learn from those mistakes that defines you, not those mistakes themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times, you know, what people really identify with in suspense is the sort of constant building of tension, the deep emotions in the reader. How do you, from a craft perspective, how do you build suspense? How do you make your audience feel those kind of tense moments and fear and worry?
Sorry.
Go.
I love including like a ticking clock element in all of my books. They all have them. I can't always promise that they will have them, but so far, like in All Your Twisted Secrets, they have an hour to decide which of these teens locked in a room, like which of them they're going to kill, otherwise they'll all die. In These Deadly Games, she has 24 hours to play a game that a kidnapper who's kidnapped her sister is forcing her to play in order to save her sister's life. In Lying in the Deep, there's the ticking clock element that she has to solve this murder before they make port or the killer strikes again. Like, there's always something propelling, like a time-based element propelling these characters and the readers through the story in addition to whatever's going on. And I love ticking clocks. I think they create this sense of urgency that also makes it more believable for the characters to make mistakes. Because when you're under a time crunch, you're not always going to make the perfect decisions because you're kind of being really reactive. And I think it gives a good opportunity for these teens to mess up.
I think I have in Your Blood, My Bones, which is my sophomore novel. It's the same. It's a ticking time, and it's a very claustrophobic setting. And these 3 friends are trapped in a farmhouse by something that's in the forest, and they're given until the end of the month to decide which of them is going to make it out alive, or work together to figure out a backdoor or another plan. And it's that sense of, if we don't figure this out, only one of us is going to make it out. We can either turn against each other or we can work together. But in The Whispering Dark, so The Whispering Dark features a deaf protagonist, and I really played on her lack of information and the hole in her comprehension, because she's missing a whole lot of information to build suspense throughout the story, because there's always this sense of she's 10 steps behind everybody else. She's not getting all the information. She's missing things. There's this feeling of somebody's behind me. Is this another classmate who's been calling my name, or is it something with teeth? Like, I don't know what it is. And so she's sort of driven by this uncertainty of she's not fully aware of what's going on around her. She's a little lost. She's a little disoriented. And I really took a lot of the way she perceives the world in order to give an unsettling sense of wrongness that sort of permeates the entire story and kind of keeps readers turning the page as she's stumbling through her freshman year.
With horror specifically, I think it's really fun to do the very classic arc of, like, you start with a very typical day to set, like, this is how the characters are doing, this is what their life is like, and then you just kind of slowly peel away the layers until it gets worse and worse and worse. It's like a horrible lasagna. But so, like, with This Delicious Death, really the hook and the moment that everything falls apart is when, one of the girls, Val, goes feral and she murders this boy. And from there, that kicks off the rest of the book. But what I wanted to do was make sure that I didn't go too big at the very beginning so that I could amp it up and up and up as the book continues. So it goes from, like, a murder mystery that seems to just involve these girls to realizing there is a much bigger conspiracy at hand because of the reason that Val went feral. It was outside of her control, and they find out later that she was actually drugged on purpose. And so being able to sort of widen the scope of what is scary was a really fun way to build that tension, because it went out from this very small problem to suddenly this is something that's impacting everybody at this music festival. All of the roads out are closed. There's like a quarantine happening. I swear I had nothing to do with the Burning Man situation. I
was thinking about
I got like 10 reader messages that were like, so what's that about? I'm like, I don't control the Burning Man.
Or the weather.
Or the weather. I didn't do anything this time. But so, and then like having it be this sort of thing where the girls are like, we're doing this just for ourselves, to, we actually have to save quite a few people, because suddenly there are, people morphing into these cannibal monsters, and everything's just really going off the deep end if they aren't able to solve the initial question. So being able to widen the scope is a really great way to approach it, I find.
I think from now on, whenever I write terrible things happening to my characters, I'm gonna think of lasagna.
Yeah. It's either that or 7-layer bean dip. Depends on the vibe. This book was a
Depends
lasagna.
on the book, I guess. Moving on to setting an atmosphere. All of your books have such a strong sense of setting. You have a music festival, you have a cruise ship, you have a school where magical stuff is going on, and in a lot of ways they're quite contained environments. I would love to know how you use the setting to enhance a sense of suspense.
I'm like a huge setting freak, so. So I am originally from the West. I'm from Utah, and many people are not super familiar with Utah out here, but it's largely desert once you get into the lower half of it. And I grew up camping in the desert, spending a lot of time there, and there is a very eerie stillness to the desert that I think is underutilized in horror. And so when I was coming up for a location for this fictional music festival, I was like, I want it to be the creepiest desert I can find. And so I was like, let's stick it in the Mojave. It's really hot. There's animal bones all over the damn place. There's like these fantastic rock formations. So what I did was I made it so that the music festival takes place in this valley that is walled off by rocks, and there's only one road in and out, because I wanted it to be that sort of bottle episode thing where the moment you cut off access to that one road, it's like immediately everything goes to hell. And so I wanted to utilize all of the things that were already there in the natural setting to be able to amplify the story itself, which is also something I did with my first book, which was a little bit more New England heavy, where you can play on things like the weather being terrible and like, oh, it's so misty today. Does that mean that there's a monster in the woods that I seem to be able to see? Maybe so. It's one of my absolute favorite things to play with, and I think that if you are a writer, highly recommend picking a setting that you're able to sort of twist into something that is more sinister than it is at first glance.
I loved playing with the cruise ship setting for Lying in the Deep, because you typically think of cruise ships as like really fun, really exciting. There are all these different sections of the ship. There are the different restaurants. There's the pool. You can have pool parties there. There's just like all these fun areas to go, but and being on the ocean is like you have this like unlimited expanse. It's this sense of freedom. But then suddenly you're trapped in the middle of the ocean with a murderer on board, and suddenly that whole setting just reverses in terms of how you feel about it. Suddenly you're trapped. There aren't many places to hide. I mean, it depends on the size of the cruise ship. In this one, it's like 500 people capacity, so maybe on the bigger ones, more places to hide. But I loved turning that super fun setting just like on its head and trapping them in a place that previously was supposed to be such an escape, and suddenly they want to escape from being on board with the killer. Yeah, it was just super fun to dig into that.
Not to like interrupt, but I went on semester at sea, and
Oh my
let me
God.
tell you, I did in fact hide from someone in a life jacket container at one point, because there's really nowhere you can go.
I love that, and now I wish I knew that beforehand, so I could have had someone hide in a life jacket container. They were not as creative with where they did try to hide.
I was gonna say, my cruise is already my idea of like absolute terror. I was scarred as Titanic as a child. Already, I would be expecting that to happen to me.
Okay.
Like, I don't want to be at sea, trapped on a boat in any situation. So it's like, already a perfect horror setting.
Right, and for anyone who gets motion sick, I guess it's not really the best
Yeah, it's
area.
do not recommend.
I agree with what Kayla said about, being, kind of a setting junkie. I love to make it feel like, another character in the story. So it's a living, breathing part of the story from beginning to end. And with The Whispering Dark, it takes place on a college campus. It's Boston in the fall, or just outside Boston in the fall. And so I think that, you were saying misty New England, like you have your rainy days, your gray days, the leaves are coming off the trees, and so the way that the world moves around the characters and is really something I dwell in when I want moments to feel especially high octane, or slow them down and make them feel very creepy, or like there's something lurking. And even I switched it over in Your Blood, My Bones, which takes place in Maine in the spring. It's raining a lot, and they're in this very pastoral setting, and it's just field after field after field, and nothing. It's all overgrown, it's empty, and it has just kind of a different sort of stillness in the desert, but still a very profound sense of isolation. And just sort of playing on that and how the world is shaping the characters and shaping their decision making, or how the setting itself is boxing them into a decision, based on what the weather is, or what's happening into the land around them. And so it really is something I kind of like to dig into to propel the story forward.
I think for my setting, I grew up on Cape Cod, which obviously a lot of people go there on vacation. So I've always been kind of interested in the way people perceive places they vacation, which is that you kind of see it in this idealized way where, like, you know, you expect the weather to be perfect, you expect everything to kind of cater to your entertainment. And I kind of like sort of looking at what's beneath that with this sort of perfect tropical island, which is all sandy beaches and flowers and like what's beneath that, what's there when the tourists aren't there, kind of what is the space, what could the space be if it wasn't your kind of perfect vacation. And then I also really liked kind of like the cruise ship, you're so contained that there's a lot you can really play with, like trapping your character and forcing them to confront stuff rather than being like, I'm out of here, like most reasonable people would probably do.
Right.
So yeah, definitely the containment was a huge factor, and also like having written it during the pandemic, I don't know how much of that you experienced too, but that sensation of being stuck in a place.
Yeah, I feel like all of my books, I mean, even my first book, which I wrote before the pandemic, but especially the 3 after, isolation plays a big theme in all of my books because we all experience that, obviously. Being in kind of really scary situations and being so detached from other people we love or other people who can help us, we felt very alone. So that has definitely spilled into my writing.
Okay, so we're gonna change gear a little bit and talk about twists, plot twists. What do you think the best, like, what are the key elements? What makes a good twist in a story?
I think one of my favorite things as a reader, when I come up to a twist, is when I feel like I get it right before the twist happens. If it blindsides me completely, then I just kind of, I can't buy into it. I'm like, well, I didn't see this coming at all, so it feels kind of shoehorned in. Not always, but often. Or if I see it coming from the start of the book, then a lot of times I'll get bored with the book. So it's kind of this sort of feeling where you get it right before the characters do. When I'm reading something and it nails it, this is it. You know, it's what I try to do. I don't know if I achieve it, but it's definitely the goal I'm striving for.
I think it's good when there can really be a bunch of plausible outcomes because it makes, you know, the red herrings more believable. Like especially if the character's motivations all really line up with potentially being the person who could have done it. I think that it really helps to not maybe solve the twist early. And I don't know, I think there are all sorts of really good twists though. I think there's no one right way to write a twist.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with subverting readers' expectations. Where with my second book, and I'll talk about this in somewhat veiled terms as to not give it away, but there was a character I set up very much with the intention of playing on a very specific YA trope of like handsome, attractive guy who seems funny and charming, and then maybe he's not quite so charming. But being able to sort of take that character archetype and go, you know this guy, right? Maybe you don't know him. And just being able to sort of not come out of left field by any means, but make people question what they think about not only the story, but maybe even the genre itself is always very fun for me. Yeah, and we got it. We love a red herring. Maybe 4 red herrings.
Yeah.
Do the fish market. It's great.
I also love when there's like a double twist when you're like, yes, I got it, and they're like, you kind of got it, but then, you know, something even bigger happens, and somehow I don't. They're hard to write for sure.
Yeah.
But when somebody pulls that off, I am always in awe. Do you always know your twists ahead of time? Do you ever surprise yourself? Do you ever think to yourself, I'm gonna leave some breadcrumbs and figure this out later?
So I don't always know. I like to talk about all your twisted secrets for this one because that one I wrote, that was my first book I got published, and when I wrote the first draft of that, I thought it was someone who isn't even in the book anymore. And I got to the end of that draft and I figured out who it really was, and it was this eureka moment, and then I had to rewrite the whole thing. So that was like my first experience, like rewriting the book because I had to change everything. And then from then on, I didn't want to have to rewrite all my books. Like I didn't want to have to write them twice. So going forward, I would outline and know whodunit or whatever the mystery is before I started drafting to save myself just oodles of time.
It does kind of tie into the plotter versus pantser discourse
Yeah.
to a certain degree, because with my first book, I very much pantsed it. I remember being like 60 pages from the end, and I was like, I kind of know what's going to happen. I guess I'll find out. Whereas with my second book, I had to outline because I was on an absolutely bananas deadline. So having to actually put in the thought of how I was going to do it was so different for me, as opposed to doing my typical method, which is just like, maybe I'll try this and see how that works. Maybe I'll try this. It was very much just like, nope, we got to have a plan and stick to it.
Yeah, I always say that when I wrote The Whispering Dark, it was kind of like the Goosebumps choose your own adventure. Like I was kind of like branching off into various, plot points, seeing is this where I wanted to go? I knew how I wanted the story to end, but I didn't quite know how I wanted to get there, and it was a lot of rewriting. And with the second book, I was on deadline, and this is kind of what you said. You don't have time to write option A, B, and C. You kind of have to pick a direction and go with it. And in terms of dropping breadcrumbs, I think I knew what the major twist was, but I threaded in sort of smaller twists that surprised me along the way and found ways to fit them in as I was going in the mix.
Yeah, it's good to kind of have a mix. I think definitely the realities of publishing, once you're on deadline while drafting a book, you have to force yourself to outline, which is definitely easier for some people than other people like me. How many hints do you like to leave? Do you like to really layer it in pretty heavily? Do you like to let your reader kind of make the jumps more freely? Do you find yourself adding more hints or taking away because you hinted too much when you are revising your story?
Oh, I always have to add them in later. It's like the sort of thing where I will finish a book and then I have to go back and be like, well, I got to the final point, so let's tie it back into the beginning. And so for me, I always write these pretty sparse first drafts that allow me a little bit more space to sort of fill in X, Y, and Z along the way, where I'll have specific scenes where I'm like, I know I can change this up a little to sort of adhere to the ending that I've set up. So for me, it tends to be I go back and add them later once I know for sure what's going to happen, as opposed to from the get-go being like, I will layer it in here. Here's the cheese. Here's the pasta. Here's the sauce. It's like, kind of gotta do that later.
Add to the lasagna, yes.
It's my metaphor of the day.
Yeah, even with an outline, my process is fairly chaotic, so I definitely don't count the number of clues I'm dropping, but I layer them in as I go during revisions. Even when I outline, I will add entire characters while drafting that act as a red herring or whatever they are, that weren't even mentioned in the outline. I was going to say something else, but I forget it, so I'll let you go.
Okay, we can come back.
Yeah.
Early on, when I was first starting to write, someone told me that drafting is like, I think my microphone went off. I think it died. Can you hear me anyway? Yeah. Okay. Oh, let's speak to yours. Thank you. So early on, when I was beginning, writing The Whispering Dark, someone told me that telling a story is like handing rocks to readers, and every time, if you hand them too many rocks, their arms get full, they get tired of holding them, and they're likely to put the book down and walk away. So for every few rocks you hand them, you have to take a rock back, and that is revealing something. And at first, when I heard that metaphor, I was like, okay, does not compute. But as I was writing it, I understand that, when I first am writing a draft, I tend to it's me handing rocks. It's rock after rock, and I have this big pile I have to sort through. And when I go back through and in revisions, clean up in revisions, it's a lot of notes from my editor saying, can you give us just a kernel of more information here? And trying to figure out how to map it out so that readers are getting the reveals at the right moment, and I am giving information in a way that feels propulsive and makes sense to the story, but it's definitely something that happens in repeated revisions. It's kind of a chaotic process. Thank you.
I did remember what I was going to say, and it's really ironic because of what it is. When I am revising, after I finish the first draft, I tend to do a lot of revisions rather than taking my time with the revision, because I need to keep all of it like in my head at once, like all the clues that I have dropped. I have to like remember it and kind of experience it as a reader too, and just read the thing over and over and over and make sure that I'm not dropping too many clues or making something too obvious. And it's just like ironic that I forgot that I do this process in order to remember. So yeah, that's just, I tend to write in many, many drafts. Like by the time I send a book to my editor, it will have been through something like 12 drafts. Yeah.
Damn.
Yo. I know. It's chaotic.
So I don't know if we're gonna have any questions from the audience, but I did want to ask before we break for questions. What are you working on next? If you can share.
Yeah, I'm excited because I actually can. So my third book we recently sold to Penguin, which I'm super stoked about. It's going to be a departure from my first two books, where I think that the first two are sisters and this one's more of like their cool cousin who comes to hang out sometimes. But it's a fantasy romance, still sapphic because that's me. And it's about a young witch who has to prove herself by doing what's called her calling, where she has to use her magic to basically solve some kind of problem so she can be a licensed witch and practice in the big city. But she winds up getting saddled with this assignment where she has to break this very old, powerful family curse on a set of twins. And she accidentally falls for one of them in the process. The problem is she is cursed that anytime someone falls in love with a female member of her family, they instantly forget about them. So she's not able to actually have any sort of romantic entanglements unless maybe there's an exception. So I'm very excited about that one. It's fun to do more of like the romance sphere and a little bit less of, not to say there's anything wrong with horror. I love horror, it's my home. But it's nice to do something a little different.
That sounds so good.
Thank you.
I love that dilemma with it, like love, falling in love.
It's very fun.
I think your mic went off as
I
well.
went, oh no.
We're losing mics.
We've got one mic. Here we go, everybody.
We'll share.
This
Yeah.
is the communal mic.
So my second book is Your Blood, My Bones, and it is considered a cottagecore horror, and it is coming out in the spring, and I'm just wrapping up the past pages right now. But it is not a sequel to The Whispering Dark, but it is a tie-in to the universe. One of the main character of Your Blood, My Bones is related to one of the characters in The Whispering Dark, and it follows a character who is a reluctant witch. She's refusing to practice and has sort of alienated that part of her family. She goes to her family's summer home in Maine and realizes that her childhood friend, who she hadn't spoken to in years, is being kept in the basement and has been part of a ritualistic sacrifice that the family has been doing for years as part of a cult. And the two of them become trapped in the house with a lot of their ghosts, and both metaphorical and otherwise, and are being hunted by something in the woods that is pitting them against one another. And they have until the start of summer to figure out how to either make it out alive, one of them, or to kill each other. And so they're pitted against each other, but trying to figure out how to, one, work through a lot of the angst between them, and two, figure out a way to work together that gets them out.
Sounds really good. Thank you. So I just announced this yesterday, so bear with me if I botch this pitch. But it's about a seniors trip to Paris gone wrong, where four girls one of them gets invited to an exclusive party in the Paris catacombs, and her best friend Ruby is the protagonist, and she goes after her with two of her classmates. They go into the catacombs to go to this party, but instead they get lost. And the second point of view is the boy who the protagonist is in love with, who above ground is trying to figure out what happened to Ruby as a media frenzy descends on Paris. So it's coming out next summer, and I am so excited about it. I can't wait.
What's the title of it?
Oh, it's called Under the Surface.
I also forgot to share my title.
Yeah.
It's Practical Rules for Cursed Witches.
Love that. Love that. So I can't really talk too much about my next book, but I can say that it is a paranormal murder mystery. And it's funny because we have two other witchy books. My characters are not so much like witches as teenagers trying to use witchcraft to solve a murder, like the mystery of a murder.
Aspiring witches.
Yes, exactly. So hopefully I'll be able to say more about that in the coming months. Questions? Do people have questions for our panelists?
I see one back here.
Hi. So I was just wondering, so this kind of sorry.
That's okay.
Because so many of you are writing about witches and witchcraft and in your next upcoming books. I was wondering about the inspiration for that. Like, where did the witch part come in there? Because I work at the Salem Witch Museum right now. It's like a very in terms of like female empowerment and like current social strife and whatnot, it's very interesting to me that three of you are working with that terminology and that basis and upcoming books. So if we have any thoughts or things about that, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, so I have a fairly unique experience in that my mom is Wiccan, and I grew up with a lot of Wiccan influence, so magic was just part of my childhood in a way I think is not particularly common, and so I took a lot of elements from the magic that I grew up with, and I just kind of cranked it up for a fantasy setting. So it was very much playing on my own experience with it, and a lot of the book has to do with family trauma and recovering from cycles of abuse and things like that. So the whole concept very much comes from my matrilineal history and being able to sort of reach back in time to these past women who have experienced so much violence and frustration at the hands of people who, you know, simply can't accept them for who they are, and being able to sort of write a book about overcoming that specifically through a queer lens of found family and empowerment that way.
It's sort of what you said about the female empowerment. The protagonist in Your Blood, My Bones is reeling after a tragedy experienced in her senior year of high school and alienated from a lot of members of her family. So it's very much similar in it's her exploring, her family history, reconnecting with her mother and her aunt and from friends from her childhood, and sort of breaking away from, her home life and figuring out who she is. And it kind of parallels her relationship with her magic and coming to terms with who she is as a person, and her healing process is very much in line with how she uses her magic. And so it's a very much a female empowerment narrative as she heals and learns to love herself and repairs her family history.
So for me, when I was a teenager, my sister and I we went through kind of a big witchcraft kind of, we were both kind of practicing witchcraft in kind of a piecemeal way, which people kind of had to do back in the 90s before there was the internet. We were kind of just like finding books, finding stores, kind of piecemeal putting together our own kind of practice of witchcraft. So I kind of took that, and again, I can't say too much about it, but I'm kind of stretching it. I'm making what if these spells had sort of catastrophic results, or what if we had ended up kind of dabbling in some really dangerous stuff. So yeah, some of it is personal experience. The two characters are kind of based on my sister and me, where my sister was very free form and I was kind of reading every single book by the letter. Yeah, I guess sort of similar to your story. It would have been very cool to have a practicing Wiccan mom. That's pretty neat.
She's a weirdo, I love her.
Anybody else?
Okay, I think you raised your hand first, or? Okay,
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Go for it.
You talked a little bit about this in terms of the witch on the bus. the Lesperance, I'm curious, in terms of trying to figure out how any potential magic systems things work, how detailed are you in your head with it, and how much of that is actually put through in the book, or is there stuff you hold back to the audience that you know how it works in your head?
I think that what's great about having an editor is they'll tell you if you have gone over or under in terms of explaining a magic system. For my third book, I have a much more defined one than I did in my first two books because they're less about magic and more about horror. But with my third book, I wanted magic to be channeled through art. So each of the witches in the book has a specific art or craft that they focus in. So the main character is a kitchen witch. She casts spells by baking. And the girl that she falls for does sort of a capoeira style fight dance to cast spells. And it was a lot of being like, how can I tie magic into a real world thing to make it a little bit more concrete as opposed to just like shooting a beam of green light at somebody and being like, boom, you're dead. So I think, yeah, it added an interesting level of structure that I hadn't worked with in the past, and I very much appreciate having an editor who says this is a really great part to expand on that. This is a really good time to show a little bit more of how magic works. It's very much the show don't tell, but specifically with world building.
All of our microphones have perished.
Yes. We'll just show.
Yeah.
I don't have a magic system.
I think same, having an editor is the same because they do tell you show don't tell, but sometimes it's nice to have someone in the margins of your document saying, all right, you can flesh things out here, you can expand on how things work here. My stories are more yours are real world as well, but it's nice to have a basis in the real world versus like a second world fantasy, so that you can sort of play on readers' expectations or understandings of physics and science and the way things work, and then just play on it just a little bit to give it a magical element, so that it feels it's like something you can see and hear and touch, because it's based on your expectations of how the world is supposed to work anyway. And but yeah, no, I think when I'm doing it, remember in my head and writing it, it's on the page, I don't always think of how to explain it until several revisions later when I really start to flesh it out.
Get really good critique partners who
Yes.
will tell you.
Critique partners will tell you this makes no sense.
Huge help.
I think for me, I'm in the revision stage right now, and my problem is I have too much. Like I've gone down so many rabbit holes on my research, and I'm trying to flesh things out, and I think now I'm paring down, like, what is this particular story? What is the magic system, and which pieces are involved? Which? Sorry.
I want to make sure that we get your question before
Oh,
we finish.
right. Did you guys, I have like two questions. Did you guys have other jobs before becoming an author, and what led you guys to becoming an author?
Yes. So writing is one of those weird things where for most authors, I would say, having a day job is something that you just have to do to a certain degree, because the way that writing pays out is largely in lump sums, which is kind of hard to survive on, especially when you're just getting started and you're not earning royalties and stuff like that. For me, I actually am putting in my notice at my day job next week, so I get to write full time. But I am a librarian currently. I would, if you are working a day job and writing, I think it's really fun to do something with books, especially if you're writing YA. Working with teenagers is such a boon, and being able to just like talk to your target audience, because occasionally I read a YA book where I'm like, I don't think you've talked to a teenager since like 2002. They're like, radical, bro, let's go. I don't know about that. But yes, so that is my experience with it. Before that, I worked retail, as I think we all have to work in the retail mines at least part of our lives. But yeah, so generally speaking, expect a day job first.
I've only been writing full time for about a year and a half now. Before then, I worked in marketing for various startups, including one that's actually in the publishing industry. I used to work at BookBub, which some people might be familiar with, deeply discounted ebooks via email. You get an alert every day. It's very cool. Sign up. I don't work for them anymore. But that's it. Unbiased. I'm still biased. And I would say that even those of us who write full time, most of us still have a side hustle just because it is so hard to make ends meet just with writing. So, but there are other ways to diversify your income with writing. So I'm also right now doing freelance writing for video games. So doing narrative writing, and it's like been really fun to get started with that. So there are like, yeah.
I have to ask you about that. That rocks.
Because I love playing video games too. So like finding creative ways to supplement your income could be an option as well.
So prior to sitting down and writing a book, I was a social worker, and I kind of same thing, working with teens. So, and I, which I find to be fantastic work, and I loved my job, but I left to be a mom. And so while I was, at home with a newborn, I thought this would be a great time to try writing a book and seeing where it goes. And here I am. I have 2 kids now, and I'm still doing it. I haven't gone back to social work yet. I have 2 very little kids. But I definitely started off that way, and I worked a job that had overnight shifts, and I would write on my overnight shifts in the downtime. And, work during the day, and then when it's kind of quiet at night, I would have my laptop out and just practice. And
Highly recommend finding a job you can write at.
Yes.
If you happen to be a librarian in Massachusetts, they'll make you watch a video where they use a really pointed example that's like, ethically speaking, you maybe shouldn't write a novel on your computer. And every time I'm like, what was that? What? That's crazy, what? But yes, highly recommend a job where you can kind of sneak in a couple pages.
I work part-time as an editor, but I work in tech research, so it's completely different from book writing. And I think it would, being part-time, I went part-time when I had kids, and just having some days where I can write is hugely helpful. But I also love my day job because I get paid regularly. Publishing is pretty chaotic, and so for example, I sold this book. They agreed to publish this book in January, and it's now September, and my contract's not even fully done yet. So you just never know when your money is going to come to you. So it is nice to have some kind of stability financially, for sure.
Also, health insurance.
And on that note,
The real spooks and scares.
thank you all so much for being here. Can I have a round of applause for this? I also want to thank our sponsors and supporters of this festival. First and foremost, the Salem Athenaeum, who puts on this whole production. The Salem Public Library, the Salem Cultural Council, the PV Essex Museum, Wicked Good Books, who is in the back over to this side. So please look at what they have. They have many wonderful books, including from this panel, and they will be over there signing afterwards. So talk to them up close and personal, get your book signed. Salem 5, who is letting us occupy this beautiful space. Copper Dog Books, Cinema Salem, Salem Academy Charter School, the House of Seven Gables, Salem Maritime National Historic Site, Essex National Heritage, Theater in the Open, and readers like you who donate to this festival. Thank you. We couldn't be here without you.